Hello, I'm Benedict Pringle, author of the website politicaladvertising.co.uk. I'm here with Sam Delaney, TV broadcaster, journalist, and author of new book, Mad Men and Bad Men. Thanks very much for joining me, Sam.
My pleasure.
Good. On the one hand, the book, I should say first, it's absolutely fantastic and I really enjoyed it. On the one hand, the book is kind of a funny, behind-the-scenes, enjoyable, gossipy account of the last 8 general elections. And I suppose on the other, it has some deep thinking about how you win elections and the role of political advertising in it. How did you come up with the idea to write the book?
Well, I wrote a book about advertising quite a few years ago, about 7 years ago, called Get Smashed, which was, as you say, a similarly kind of behind-the-scenes gossipy account of the rise of the British advertising industry, the kind of golden years between like the 60s and the 80s and all of the mad stuff that kind of occurred, and really how, you know, a generation of young kind of Herberts really like rose up through this industry, through the advertising industry, and made it the kind of, you know, epicenter of the global advertising business right here in London. So anyway, that was a, you know, a reasonably popular book, and I had a lot of fun writing it, and you know, just meeting all of these larger than life characters. I suppose one of the most popular chapters was the one that covered the rise of the Saatchis and how that was sort of intrinsically linked with the rise of Margaret Thatcher. And it was fascinating how, you know, they applied kind of the sensibilities of that so-called creative revolution in advertising, which was about being cheeky and funny and amusing and a bit flashy. You know, so all the sort of stuff that they'd learnt to apply to commercial brands, they started applying them to politics. And then I thought, well, everyone had been hostile to this idea within politics for many years. There was a sniffiness about advertising because politicians assumed that it should be on a slightly higher intellectual plane. I thought it was particularly interesting that the first person to say, no, I don't care about any of that. We've got to sell this, and we've got to sell it hard and in a clever way, was Margaret Thatcher, who would have been the last politician you would imagine would be taken by those kind of characters and that kind of thinking. Anyway, it was particularly sort of popular, that chapter. It was the one that was serialised in the newspaper, and a lot of people continued to ask me about. And in fact, you know, a TV, like a drama production company, came to me a few years ago and said, we'd like to sort of take that as a seed for a kind of a drama about the kind of, you know, this relationship between ad men and politicians. Anyway, that didn't come to anything, but it sort of sowed the seed of, you know, there's something in that chapter. And also, you know, I wrote a book about advertising, and I know a bit about advertising, but I'm actually very interested in politics, and it's not something that I'd written a great deal about before, but it's what my degree's in, and I used to work in politics for a while early in my career. And so it was just sort of an obvious marriage, because once you start looking beyond like the most famous bits, which is the Saatchis, and you start discovering all of the other characters and the evolution of the role of advertising, I just thought, this is great. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting was, I knew both, as I write in the introduction to the book, I had worked in and spent time amongst both those different sets of people, politicians in Westminster and ad people in the West End. And it seemed so contrasting, the sort of different cultures.
Tell us a bit about the cultures then.
Well, the culture of advertising. When I, you know, a lot of my family worked in advertising. I lived with my mum though in the suburbs in West London, and she worked as a receptionist in building firms and, you know, and sort of fairly dreary local companies. She worked part-time. So my idea of work was probably what a lot of people's impression of work and office life was. It was like pretty dreary. You know, no one really liked it. You did it to get your money and then, you know, whatever. But I never lived with my dad, but he had an ad agency in Covent Garden with his brother, my uncle. And occasionally in the summer holidays, once I got sort of old enough to get on the tube on my own, he'd say, "Oh, come up and see me in the office, and we'll go out for lunch or something." So when I was about 13, I got on the Piccadilly line from Hammersmith, went to Covent Garden, and it was just like, is this some sort of joke? Is this where you work? Because it seems like just a really cool, all the women are beautiful, the blokes are just sitting around taking the piss out of each other and drawing pictures in felt tip and then going out for like really nice lunches. The offices just smell of kind of coffee. There's fashion shops all around. This is just, you're having the piss. This is ridiculous. And he was sort of like, I know, right? And so I thought, well, that seems like fun. And but my dad was very dismissive about advertising. He'd sort of fallen into advertising, was kind of like, oh, you know, don't get yourself involved, really, it's a load of bollocks sort of thing, you know. But the one thing that he was really interested in, the only bit of his career in advertising that he ever took seriously, was the work he did for free for the Labour Party. That everything else, I can say this now because he's retired, so he can't jeopardise any client relationships. But I can honestly say he couldn't have given a shit about anything else. He just sort of thought this is a lot of fun and an easy way to make money. Yeah. But he was very serious and passionate about the work he did for free for the Labour Party. Anyway, I worked for the Labour Party. I worked for a Labour MP, Harriet Harman, for like a year before I went off to university. And I also worked. They were shadow cabinet. They were in opposition at the time. I worked for her and Gordon Brown and Peter Mandelson at Millbank. And it was sort of just different. It was different to both my experiences in my mum's work environment and my dad's. Everything was very serious. There was zero glamour, and it was very earnest. And I think Labour politics in particular is very earnest. You know, there's a sort of a collective sense that you're fighting the good fight, and you can't, for a moment, take anything less than 100% seriously. And, you know, again, I thought it would all be like the original House of Cards. Like, you know, sort of working in these kind of oak-panelled rooms in the Palace of Westminster, doing deals over large glasses of whiskey with silvery-haired cabinet ministers. But in fact, it was just like, it smelt of kind of, there was just these kind of quite dull buildings around Westminster. Back then, before they now have quite nice posh ones, but they were sort of like old, freezing cold Victorian school buildings. And I did lots of photocopying. Funnily enough, the other researcher who worked with me was Ed Miliband. So he was the senior researcher and I was the junior researcher. Yeah. But he actually was like considered like a wonder child. And
so obviously you've articulated you've got these two different worlds: the very serious, dry, earnest sort of political world, and you've got this sort of louche, sexy advertising world. Obviously, the book is a lot about how these two worlds come together. Are there any sort of anecdotes you could share about that give a bit of colour to that sort of those worlds meeting?
There's a lot in there. Easily my favourite is one that I have to admit is not an original story because I actually first read it in a fantastic book called Fast and Loose, funnily enough, by a guy called Jeremy Scott, who is like a living, breathing kind of David Niven, you know, / Roger Moore in The Persuaders type character, or, you know, he almost like an Austin Powers character. Yeah, he was an ad man, but he was a million other things as well. He was one of these kind of 60s, swinging 60s kind of men about town with the E-type Jag and the models and the, you know, Terence Stamp as his mate sort of lifestyle. So he wrote a fantastic book quite a few years ago called Fast and Loose. And one chapter in it, he talks about his experience of helping out on the campaign for Edward Heath in 1970. And he basically describes a story where he was working for the famous production company Garrett's, James Garrett. And Garrett asked him to sort of like handle this account with Edward Heath and all the people from the Conservative Central Office. And this guy sort of invited them all in for a meeting. And sure enough, he said, we've invited them into our flashy offices in the West End. They're a bunch of really earnest, disapproving guys in pinstripe suits who are terribly posh and terribly kind of, you know, suspicious of these fancy pants swinging 60s ad men. And but nevertheless, they agreed to come back for a follow-up meeting because this was a pitch for the business. And this time they said they would bring both Willie Whitelaw, who was the chairman of the party, and Edward Heath, who was the leader and would-be Prime Minister. And James Garrett said to this guy, Jeremy Scott, listen, they're coming back and they're bringing Heath with them, but the next meeting's got to be livelier. You've got to think of something. You're good at this sort of stuff. Just think of something to enliven the next meeting, or we're never going to win this business. And it's important business for our company because it will really put us on the map. So he said, don't worry, leave it to me. He said, so I went off down to Fortnum and Mason's and I bought quite a lot of white burgundy and some, you know, pretty smashing canapes. And then just as the icing on the cake, I went round to my old nanny's house where I kept all of my contraband, such as firearms and so forth, right? And he goes, and he had some amphetamines that had basically been banned, but were still available on the NHS up until 1964, and just before they'd been banned for basically being too much fun. He'd stockpiled a load of them and kept them round at his former nanny's house. So he said, I went round, I got a load of them, and I ground them up into a powder, and I just put a tiny amount on each canapé, for the meeting. He said it wasn't anything that you'd notice, but it might just keep the wheels turning in the meeting a bit more. And he said, unfortunately, when Heath and Whitelaw turned up, they were two very big men, and I hadn't accounted for their enormous appetites. He said they wouldn't stop eating these canapes throughout the meeting. He said, so by the end of the meeting, we couldn't get rid of them. He said it was the reverse of the first one. They kept sort of like coming up with more increasingly like harebrained ideas to, restructure the constitution or reinvent the education system. So it was basically, I'd read that story and I went to meet Jeremy Scott, in of course Chelsea where he lives, like today, to get his memories of that. And that for me was like one of the key starting points of like my research for the book, because I took a story like that and I thought, well, that kind of encapsulates the sort of anecdotes I'll be hoping to come across throughout the book.
In the book, you celebrate the 79, 83, 87 and 92 campaigns, but you seem a little underwhelmed from 97 onwards. What's changed about politics or indeed advertising that you think has made the campaigns maybe slightly more boring or not as exceptional?
Well, there's various things. First of all, those first few elections between 79 and 92 was almost the start of this kind of modern era of political advertising that I identify in the book. Of course, there had been political advertising prior to 79, but the Saatchis with Thatcher in 79 very much the first group of ad men who kind of successfully applied the sort of principles of creative commercial advertising, for which Britain had become extremely famous and brilliant at. They applied that to politics. That was quite a bold thing to do, to literally sell a political party or a political leader, just like you were selling, a brand of fabric conditioner or lager or something like that, with all the humour, the charm and that kind of insight and the simplicity. And over those first few elections, they were sort of experimenting and creating new ways of doing it. And so it was all kind of fresh and quite revolutionary. So that's the first reason, and it really reached an apex in 92, which I think is the most fascinating election ever, certainly the most fascinating kind of approach to political advertising in this country. And it's like a real kind of template that I would, advise any kind of political ad man or politician who's setting about a general election campaign to study the way the Conservatives and their ad team approach that election. But the things that have changed since then is, first of all, there was something fantastic about politics in that era, and maybe it's just because I'm nostalgic because that was my youth, and I kind of remember having my eyes open to politics by things like Spitting Image, where there was, first of all, like a collection of kind of just mad, sort of strange, outcast eccentrics and firebrands who kind of populated the House of Commons, right? So you had people who were just like nutter caricatures, like Norman Tebbit, like Margaret Thatcher, like Neil Kinnock, like Michael Foot and Roy Hattersley. These are like brilliantly engaging, compelling characters, right? Politics became slightly more professionalised in the post-Blair era, I feel, and you got a lot of slick young guys who kind of could have just as easily, funnily enough, worked in marketing, as much politics. So perhaps that made it more bland. Also politically, in the 80s especially, you had a revolutionary Conservative Party leadership who were deregulating capitalism and, bringing a whole new approach to like politics and the way in which the state should be run on the one hand. And you had a Labour Party who were extremely left-wing, on the other hand. So, during the Michael Foot era, and even though Kinnock was trying to, modernise them after 83, he was still unable to for a number of years. So you had a really left-wing party who were pro-nuclear disarmament. They wanted to renationalise all the industries. They were going to use tax to redistribute wealth in a pretty radical way. So you had two really opposing parties, which I assume from an ad man's point of view is great, because you've got two really distinct brands, right? And so you're selling them. There's a real head-to-head clash there of ideas. Again, post-92, the next election was 97. Tony Blair was in charge. The Labour Party was completely changed. The Tory Party under John Major had become more moderate. Things had moved more to the centre. And the third reason is that political parties have become less popular and there are less members and they've all got less money, which means that the largesse they were able to demonstrate in their ad campaigns before has gone away. A lot of politicians, just like kind of commercial brands as well, they never really know what sort of impact advertising's having. But as long as you've got the money, you think might as well throw a load at it just in case it makes 1% difference, and that's the crucial difference. That was basically their approach. But when you haven't got much money, you kind of back off. Politicians became much more controlling as well. In the era of Mandelson and Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair, where there was a huge kind of paranoia and every decision had to be made right from a very tight group in the centre, you weren't about to say to some sort of renegade ad man, like Thatcher had done to the Saatchis, go for your life, do what you think's best, just make it good, which is effectively what Thatcher said. You would get no one in New Labour, and I suspect, you know, Cameron's Conservatives having that kind of cavalier attitude to their branding.
Yeah. And it's interesting you touch on that sort of slightly controlling attitude, perhaps, of Blair, Mandelson, Campbell. Do you think that is the reason why a lot of the most celebrated ads are actually for the Conservative Party? Or is there something about the Conservative Party brief, if you like, which is just easier to hit a home run on?
Someone who is actually not a Conservative MP, he's a Lib Dem, said to me, but he had worked at Saatchis before he went into politics, said, first of all, you've got to understand, he went, all the people involved in the Conservative Party are people who've worked in business. So they understand and have a lot of experience about the relationship with your kind of ad people and your marketing people. So they understand it better. That was one interesting point that someone made to me. Perhaps that's true. Also, you know, the Conservative Party has almost always been a kind of a well-oiled machine run like a big corporation. You know, it's always, pretty much always had more money than the Labour Party. And it kind of it seems to me, it was like a machine designed for winning elections and worry about the other stuff later, sort of thing. Harold Wilson famously described the Labour Party set up as a penny farthing machine. You know, it's a rickety old mess and kind of always has been. It's better now than it was back in like the 60s when he described it that way. For many years, you know, they were years behind the Conservatives in terms of embracing advertising, because they thought advertising, first of all, that was the enemy because it was people who peddled capitalism, which back in those days Labour weren't particularly keen on. And they just thought it kind of belittled and demeaned politics to sell it like a box of soap powder. So there was always like kind of a snobbery in principle towards advertising. And, you know, the Conservatives were much more... Margaret Thatcher sort of set the tone because her thing with all of her advisors, whether it was advertising or other, she would surround herself with the best people. And as far as she was concerned, if you were the expert, you were the ones making the decisions. And she would say to Tim Bell, you know, of course, the boss at Saatchis at the time, listen, you're not going to advise me on my defence policy, so why would I advise you on how to make the ads? You know, just make them right, sort of thing. Labour Party is, I mean, the very setup of the Labour Party, especially back before Blair, is one committee on top of another. You know, it was kind of so obsessed with being the most democratic institution in the world that nothing ever got done. And the stories of the ad men who worked for them back in the 80s, it was like they were the client from hell. You know, you couldn't get anything done without it being signed off by about 1 trillion subcommittees. And as a result, no idea would ever kind of, you know, end up the way that the ad man envisaged it. It would be some watered down, kind of crazy, distorted and convoluted sort of idea. So, this is someone, funnily enough, somebody who worked in advertising said to me the other day, reminded me of that old thing, you know, a camel is a horse created by committee, you know. And there's something about that between, like, you know, the Conservatives who had a setup where it was like, okay, I'm in charge, you're my ad agency, go make a load of ads that will make us win the election. How do we win the election? The Saatchis would you know, usually say, well, the easiest way to win it is just to tap Labour and make everyone too scared of voting for them. They go, great, do it. Yeah. Labour would have stroked their chins, had a huge meeting, maybe had a conference, all argued about it, and in the end decided that they shouldn't be advertising anyway because it was a grotesque sort of practice for capitalists. Yeah, that's an interesting thing that people say that a lot of political advertising is very negative and is perhaps a real poison on politics and it is something that we could do without. What would you say to those sorts of people? Well, first of all, I think that, you know, if you're going to advertise, that you are advertising to win elections and win votes. You know, there is other elements of politics beyond just winning elections, you know, and there is of course, a more sort of refined and nuanced, discourse to be had about politics. And, you'd like to see that perhaps more in, the Commons and wherever, and in the media. But, if you're going to spend money on advertising, you're doing it to win. And all I know empirically from researching this book is unequivocally negative advertising wins, because, as Tim Bell has said many times, people who float, and there's not many of them, there's more now than there was, but the floating vote back in those days, and there was a very small amount. In fact, the pollster, Bob Worcester, says, it was always 4%, because hardly anyone, 60% of people have got a party they're already aligned to. Then there's another 20% who are, 60% are aligned to one of the two main parties. There's an extra 20% who are just the other kind of periphery parties. And then there's 20% left who might decide the election. But only a quarter of them are in seats that are marginal anyway. So in the end, it boils down to just a few thousand people. And those people are the least likely to be engaged in politics day to day. So they're the least likely to read about politics in the newspapers. They're the least likely to read a manifesto. They're the least likely to watch Newsnight. Okay, they're politically disengaged people, but they feel an almost patriotic obligation to vote when election time comes around. So how do they make their decisions? Well, they make them often in snap ways, sort of thing, and they change from one election to another. This is all not my speculative opinion. This is what Robert Worcester says that repeated polls of his over the years and Murray have shown. And so the most easy way to influence that tiny amount of people who decide elections is usually fear of the other side, And Margaret Thatcher and successive Tory leaders, and certainly the Saatchis, understand that, and, Labour understand it better now than they did back in the old days, but there used to be a sense of, well, we're not going to demean things.
Yeah.
However, it is true that, the real people who really understand it are the Saatchis, right? Jeremy Sinclair, who was the guru, the creative guru who wrote all of these ads and mastermind behind all these ads at Saatchis, his motto in any election is hit first, hit hardest, and keep on hitting, right? That's the only way you can win. The other thing Jeremy Sinclair said to any politician he sat down with was kill or be killed. But throughout the book, you get examples of the political leaders are always less keen on negative advertising. Not because they're nicer, right, but because they feel that they should be elected on the basis of their virtues. So Margaret Thatcher began to get frustrated after 2 terms in office that Saatchis continued to advise her to go negative against the Labour Party, because she began to think, hang on, I've been in power now for 8 years, and I think we should start to brag a bit about all of our achievements. And they used to say, people don't care about that. You're the government. They very rarely believe anything you're saying, but you can scare them about what the other lot might do if they get in, right? People don't like change. That was the sort of, core belief of the Saatchi team. And therefore, if you can scare them about the opposition, then that's the best thing you can do. And, they even presented her with a poster in 1983, a picture of the then leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot, who was in his early 70s, and he was fairly decrepit because he'd injured his leg. And it was a picture of him looking, quite scruffy, as was his way, walking in the wind across Hampstead Heath with a walking stick in his donkey jacket. And the headline said, even pensioners are better off under the Conservatives. And Margaret Thatcher nearly threw Tim Bell out of the room, because she was saying, we cannot talk about the leader of the opposition in this way.
Yeah.
But Alistair Campbell, years later, said to Tony Blair when he was having a similar kind of, why do we have to be so nasty about the Conservatives all the time? They are sort of like our colleagues. We can't just this is demeaning. It's below us. Alistair Campbell said, he used to say to Tony Blair, listen, Tony, don't think just because you're trying to be nice, they're going to not kill you. Don't think that you can play the nice guy and people might be nice back to you, because they won't. Because he understood the same as such as kill or get killed.
That's interesting. And when you were going through this book, obviously you probably had some preconceptions about the things that you might cover. What did you learn through writing it and through meeting all these amazing characters that you perhaps didn't expect or that surprised you?
Well, probably the main lesson was that I suppose I would have started out thinking, oh yeah, negative advertising, you know, that's awful. Come on, politics should mean more than that, than just slagging each other off. And, you know, and it probably should, but I did understand exactly, I grew to understand exactly why it wins. And to be honest, I sort of came to think of advertising as a better influence on politics than I had assumed I would. I tried to start with an open mind, but my knowledge of both worlds thought, well, politics is a serious business. You know, I've studied politics and I kind of, you know, take it fairly seriously and have a sort of a reasonable understanding of it. And I think, you know, what could advertising possibly do to add to this process? But the truth is, what I also know is that, you know, democracy is always a bit wobbly in this country. A lot of people are disengaged. A lot of people are indifferent, don't vote, don't engage in the debates or the issues. And, you know, you can either hope for a better world in which some people kind of collectively decide one day that they're not going to stop watching Coronation Street and instead they're going to watch Newsnight religiously and read leader columns in the Times and the Telegraph every day, right, or the Guardian. Or you can think, well, you know what, these ads, that their job and what these people are experts at is kind of giving a succinct and immediate and compelling message about the issues that matter. And although ad men will always play fast and loose with the details and the facts, the broad message about the respective values of the two parties competing for your vote is almost always accurate. And I think sometimes for a lot of people that's the best you can hope for, and therefore it does have quite good influence. The other thing is that politicians, now more than ever, they don't understand, they don't respect the fact that you have to make an effort to kind of communicate in a way that makes sense to people, right? And to give clear messages that people will understand. They don't think I sort of listen to them on the news. I work on Sky News a lot, and I sit there listening to the interviews, and I think, are you trying to make no sense? Because do you think if you don't make any sense, then no one will pick you up on the holes in what you're saying? That's what I'm convinced loads of them do. Now more than ever, the younger generation are the worst. And I think, well, ad men at least are doing the opposite to that. They're thinking of a really explicit message and they're trying to hit you straight between the eyes with it. So I think that's quite good, actually, and I was surprised that I wound up with that conclusion.
Definitely. I mean, it's so interesting that even now with the sort of 24-hour news agenda and Twitter and Facebook, whenever a political party releases a poster, it seems to have a huge impact on the narrative of elections. There seems to be something quite magical about political advertising. What do you think it is that fascinates people?
Because because politics is boring, politicians are dickheads, and political coverage is just tedious and dreary. But advertising is exciting and aggressive and sexy, and so really, you know, people say its influence is in decline, and maybe that's true. I don't know, but you know, really, elections are the sexiest parts of politics, and advertising is the sexiest part of elections, aren't they? I mean, you know, politics in between elections, no one's interested. It's about constituency surgeries in drafty church halls or committee meetings that no one cares less about, right? But when you get to an election, it's awesome because on the news every night, there's people going head to head in a sort of battle to the death, right? And everyone's doing dirty tricks and there's loads of scandals and everyone's stitching each other up and it's like a soap opera. And the people kind of who are the key architects of that are like ad men who are thinking up stunts and posters and, you know, brilliant lies that we all know are lies but are really exciting. And I think, you know, that's fun for most people, you know.
Great. Thanks very much. So the book is out on the 5th of February. It's called Mad Men and Bad Men. Sam, thanks very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.